morning, everybody. I think I know most faces, but for those that don't know me, I'm Catherine Backleder. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the university, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this community lecture series on behalf of all of the UniGib team. Today, we are very privileged to host the Honourable Dr. Joseph Garcia, who will be sharing his insights on a topic that sits at the very heart of Gibraltar's identity: Gibraltar and Europe, past, present, and future. Dr. Garcia occupies a unique position in our community, serving as both a distinguished historian and a central figure in Gibraltar's contemporary political life. A scholar by training, he holds a first-class honours degree in history and a PhD focused on Gibraltar's modern political and constitutional development. Many of you will also know him as the author of Gibraltar, The Making of a People, a seminal work that remains essential reading for understanding Gibraltar's evolution as a nation. Alongside these academic credentials, Dr. Garcia has dedicated over 2 decades to public service. A Member of Parliament since 1999 and Deputy Chief Minister since 2011, he is responsible for European affairs, Brexit-related work, and Gibraltar's international representation. This has placed him at the very centre of the negotiations that will define Gibraltar's future relationship with the European Union. It is this rare combination of scholar and practitioner that makes Dr. Garcia's perspective so invaluable. He doesn't just understand the archives of Gibraltar's past, he is actively involved in the writing of the next chapter of Gibraltar's history. Today's lecture will trace Gibraltar's journey with Europe, from the days before the European Economic Community, through the years of EU membership, and into the complex post-Brexit landscape we navigate today. This discussion, of course, could not be more timely, as we stand at this critical juncture in establishing a new treaty framework. The outcomes will shape everything from trade and mobility to our daily lives and our regional stability. Dr. Garcia's lecture promises to bring clarity to some of these complexities, offering both a long view of history and first-hand insight into the negotiating table. So without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to the Honourable Dr. Joseph Garcia.
So thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for those words, and good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to be here and to speak at the University of Gibraltar, an institution that was born many years ago now out of a political dream and which is now firmly rooted in the reality of this community. A university that embodies ambition to engage, to learn, and to assert Gibraltar's place in the world. I'm very grateful to you, Vice-Chancellor, to Dr. Danifa, and to the team for the kind invitation to address you this morning. And I am particularly proud to continue my association with the university as an honorary researcher. This morning, I want to tell a story about how a small community was shaped by decisions taken far away. It is a story of how Gibraltar became a casualty of ideological battles over Europe fought within the political class of the United Kingdom. These were internal policy battles. Gibraltar had no voice, no vote, and no say. So Gibraltar and Europe, past, present, and future. A topic, as the Vice-Chancellor has rightly said, that could scarcely be more pertinent, given the publication only 3 weeks ago of the full text of a treaty to govern Gibraltar's future relationship with the European Union. and a topic too which is intensely political, strategic, and also emotional. Because 53 years ago, the United Kingdom joined the then European Economic Community, and Gibraltar followed. And 10 years ago, the United Kingdom left the European Union, and again, Gibraltar followed. We did not make that choice. We did not shape it. We could not stop it, but we had to deal with the consequences. So we'll argue that Gibraltar was a victim, that those decisions taken over 1,000 miles away set us upon a remarkable journey. So it's a story of a small people shaped by borders, sometimes open, sometimes closed, and often weaponized. It is also a story of how the impact of global politics cascade down into very real local consequences. A story of how the UK's internal war on Europe, waged over decades, ultimately swept Gibraltar along with it. First, to leave the European Union, and then to negotiate a future relationship with it. This was not an easy journey. It was unexpected and without precedent. No member state has left the European Union before. Needless to say, we were heavily constrained by our connection to one particular member state. So in developing a number of these themes, I propose to structure it in parts chronologically. And as a historian, you would probably expect nothing less. And as we dwell upon where we have been, where we have ended up, and where we are going, a decade on from the Brexit referendum is a good moment in which to reflect on such questions. So I want to set the context first with a few words about the period before membership. This was the time before 1973. It was a different world, and certainly a different Europe. A continent divided by ideology, symbolized by the Berlin Wall, when Gibraltar lived a blockade of its own in this small corner of Europe. A fascist military dictatorship next door, and a closed border. That was a time when some 60% of our economy depended on UK defence expenditure, when the largest employer was a naval dockyard, and we were physically cut off from the European Union in every material respect. Franco's deliberate policy of coercion and isolation proved to be a failure, of course. At the time, the European ideal was very much in its infancy. For Gibraltar, Europe was not a space of opportunity or of rights. It was distant, theoretical, and physically unreachable. And it is essential to understand this background in order to fully appreciate what comes later. So while in the UK debates about the European Economic Community were beginning to stir, in Gibraltar the wider prospect of European membership was neither discussed nor imagined. The reality of living under siege made the demands of the present far more immediate than the political experiments of the future. Parity of wages with the United Kingdom, for example, was a far more practical concern. So the European Economic Community was established with the signing of the Treaty of Rome in 1957. And 6 years later, the UK decided to join. It is not well known that they tried 2 times, in 1963 and then again in 1967. On both occasions, they were shut out by France. So General de Gaulle vetoed UK entry. And at the time, he rather ominously predicted that Britain was incompatible with Europe, that it had an island mentality, and that the United Kingdom harbored a deep-seated hostility to any pan-European project. That left a bad taste. And the irony was not lost on anyone that General de Gaulle had more reason than most to be grateful to the United Kingdom. His double veto dented the perception of France and of Europe in the UK itself. So for the UK, in the end, it was very much a case of third time lucky. The moment finally came when, together with Denmark and Ireland, they finally joined the European Economic Communities on the 1st of January 1973. There was an immediate impact on Gibraltar as well. UK membership applied to Gibraltar under Article 2274 of the then Treaty of Rome. This stated that its provisions shall apply to the European territories for whose external relations a member state was responsible. And Gibraltar opted for a very substantial membership of the EEC. It became the only British overseas territory that was part of a European club. The application of the treaties to Gibraltar was, as we know, subject to certain exemptions. These were set out in Articles 28 to 30 of the 1972 UK Act of Accession. These were that Gibraltar remained outside the common agricultural policy, remained outside the common fisheries policy, applied no VAT, and remained outside the customs union. So it was a unique status, a form of tailor-made, a la carte membership that reflected Gibraltar's geography, economy, and political reality. In the context of the proposed treaty relationship today, there are two important points worth noting. The first is that the new relationship will also be unique and tailor-made. And the second, that Gibraltar will connect with Europe in areas where we were excluded from during our time of membership. But more of that in a few minutes. An important marker in this story is that within 18 months of joining the EEC, the United Kingdom had a referendum to establish whether they wanted to leave within 18 months. Deeply held views on the question of Europe this time divided the Labour Party. In their manifesto, for both the February and October 1974 elections, Labour had promised voters to renegotiate the UK's EU membership, and the party was split on the issue. The Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, made use of the referendum as a political tool to manage those internal divisions. They say that history sometimes repeats itself. Fast forward, some 40 years later, Prime Minister David Cameron was to apply the same solution to the same problem. An important difference, as we know only too well, was the outcome in each particular case. So in June 1975, 67.2% voted in favor of continued membership of the EEC. But that the referendum took place so soon was quite remarkable in itself. In any case, Gibraltar was not included in that vote, a reminder that our destiny has often turned on UK domestic politics and not on our own choices. So the truth is that the impact of joining the EEC proved to be quite limited for Gibraltar at the beginning. The land border with Spain was physically shut. There were no overland trade routes between Gibraltar and Europe. Spain itself was not a member of the European Club. This facilitated the negotiation of that tailor-made solution I referred to earlier. For the Gibraltar government was consulted on our terms of membership. And Sir Joshua Hassan, I remember, told me once that they acted largely on the advice that came from the United Kingdom itself. Times have changed, of course. We are now lucky enough to have our own homegrown experts in European law. Primarily the Attorney General, Michael Yamas, who is a pillar of knowledge and experience, very ably assisted by the Director of Gibraltar House in Brussels, Daniel D'Amato. They have guided us expertly and professionally through the complex minefield of EU exit and the future relationship negotiations. On the 1st of November 1993, the European Economic Community became the European Community. That already made a statement. And in 2009, it became the European Union, an even stronger statement. Each successive treaty development rung alarm bells among anti-Europeans in the United Kingdom. But for Gibraltar, the period from 1973 to 1986 was by and large pretty uneventful. We were able to benefit from four fundamental freedoms: the free movement of people, the free movement of establishment, the freedom of capital, and the freedom to provide services. And generally speaking, people here were more pro-European in outlook than their counterparts in the United Kingdom. But the European community remained a distant entity. It was only when Spain joined in 1986 that Europe finally came to our doorstep. A taste of what was to come was delivered by Madrid almost immediately. It was not enough for them to open the border in exchange for EU membership, because the border could not continue closed. They demanded and obtained a negotiating process on the sovereignty of Gibraltar as well. And if that too was not enough, less than 24 hours after signing the accession treaty, with the ink not yet dry on Spain's signature, Madrid promptly sent a dispatch to the Foreign Office in London. That set out that their accession to the EEC did not imply any changes with regards to Spain's position on Gibraltar. And London simply took note. So there were two distinct phases in Gibraltar's European experience I propose to argue today. The first from 1973 until 1985, which is generally calm, and the second from 1986 until 2020, which is far more turbulent than the previous one. For Spanish accession turned Gibraltar's membership on its head. They sought to probe, challenge, and undermine the status which Gibraltar had enjoyed in Europe. Processes, procedures, and institutions which had not been questioned by anyone for over a decade were suddenly placed under the microscope. Gibraltar found itself as a target for newly elected hostile Spanish MEPs, in the firing line of nationalistic Spanish commissioners, even in the sights of a Spanish judge or two. That same sovereignty debate had played out at the United Nations for decades. In 1986, it spread from New York to Brussels as well, where Spain found a new institutional arena in which to advance its claim. That arena became the corridors of the European Commission, the committees of the European Parliament, and the meeting rooms of the European Council. So Spanish membership gave rise to a whole range of issues as a consequence of the ongoing claim to the sovereignty of Gibraltar. But before any of that, before they even formally joined, the Gibraltar-Spain land frontier had to be addressed. Those gates had been slammed shut by General Franco in 1969. They remained closed for nearly 10 years after Franco's death. They opened in February 1985, 10 months before Spanish accession. And they opened because they had to. It is significant that the frontier had been closed for longer by a democratic Spain than it had been closed under the dictatorship. And this did little at the time to inspire confidence. But in retrospect, the UK committed a serious strategic error. This was not merely a missed opportunity. It shaped the next 4 decades of Gibraltar's experience in Europe. London could have insisted that all restrictions against Gibraltar be lifted unconditionally as a price of Spanish entry. It is the firm approach General de Gaulle took with the UK itself in 1963 and again in 1967. But in this case, the UK adopted a more conciliatory posture in the hope that Spain might reciprocate. As it turned out, that was, as I said, a serious error of judgment, and that failure of UK policy soon became only too apparent. And successive Spanish governments came to see the European project as a vehicle through which to progress their claim to Gibraltar. This became clear almost at once. If there is one issue that encapsulates Gibraltar's troubled relationship with Spain inside the EU, that issue is the airport. Within 18 months of joining, Spain vetoed an air liberalization package on the basis of its application to Gibraltar Airport. The UK was at first critical of the actions of Madrid. However, 6 months and one U-turn later, the UK too agreed to suspend Gibraltar Airport from the measure. The interests of the UK took primacy then over the interests of Gibraltar. This was not only about winning Spanish goodwill. The aviation package was expected to be of considerable financial benefit to UK airlines. And faced with the choice, perhaps unsurprisingly, the UK chose itself. So Gibraltar Airport was excluded, except that it was called a suspension. A suspension which would only be lifted when Gibraltar applied an Anglo-Spanish agreement on the airport, which had been concluded in December 1987. When Gibraltar challenged this in the European Court, the court declined to consider the substance of the case, ruling it inadmissible on technical grounds. However, the 1987 deal was never implemented, and Gibraltar remained excluded from successive aviation measures, and it was not until 2006, with the Trilateral Forum for Dialogue, that flights between Gibraltar and Spain were resumed under the Córdoba Agreement. And Spain agreed that it would no longer seek the suspension of Gibraltar Airport from EU civil aviation legislation. It was also agreed that all measures that Gibraltar had been excluded from would now be extended to it, and that Gibraltar would construct a new air terminal parallel to the frontier fence with direct access to another building on the Spanish side. So Gibraltar kept its side of the bargain. The new terminal opened at the end of 2011. Unfortunately, the government in Spain changed at exactly the same time. The new Partido Popular administration reversed the policy of their socialist predecessors. They moved from cooperation with Gibraltar to outright confrontation. That move was spearheaded by José Manuel Garcia Margallo. He became the most anti-Gibraltar foreign minister since the days of General Franco. And Madrid abandoned the Córdoba Agreement, even though the UK and Gibraltar did not. And those actions had consequences for Europe as a whole, when a number of aviation measures were blocked by Spain for the whole of the European Union. The UK firmly defended the principle that European law on civil aviation applied to Gibraltar Airport, and the matter then remained deadlocked. But even then, in June 2016, as we all know, the UK voted to leave the European Union. This changed the dynamics of the airport question in an instant. It became obvious to all the parties, including the European Commission, that the issue would go away once the United Kingdom exited the European Union and took Gibraltar and its airport with it. So it's worth recalling that before Brexit, Gibraltar was entitled to air connectivity with the EU as a matter of legal rights. After Brexit, we lost those rights completely. It was disappointing to say, the least, that the European Commission, the guardian of the treaties, failed to act to uphold EU law in this area. The EU institutions chose not to intervene. The United Kingdom could only hold the deadlock. Other member states offered tea and sympathy, and Spain was able to benefit from this all-round lack of interest. That was the airport past and present. So what about the future? Where does the airport fit into this jigsaw? As I said, Gibraltar now finds itself outside the EU and with no automatic rights in this area. That means that the principles we defended for decades no longer applies. The airport debate now rests firmly in the context of a new relationship with the European Union. This comes under the umbrella of a treaty agreed between the UK and the EU. You will know the UK is a signatory because of our constitutional relationship, but Gibraltar has been the main negotiator. UK has a direct military interest in the airport, and both of us have defended every inch of our sovereignty throughout the entire negotiating process. In practical terms, the result is straightforward. Flights between Gibraltar and the European Union will be possible again for the first time under a legal framework that protects Gibraltar's sovereignty and preserves our relationship with the United Kingdom. UK airlines will be able to fly between Gibraltar and the UK. EU airlines will be able to fly between Gibraltar and the EU. Treaties of this type are governed by committees. In this field, a specialized committee on aviation between the UK and the EU will be established. It will have a supervisory role to ensure that standards are met and the treaty is complied with. The mechanism for this will be inspection visits and information exchanges. But those will only take place while there are flights to the European Union or in preparation for such flights. Gibraltar has agreed to apply EU law in 4 areas through our own constitutional instruments, like we used to do when we were in the European Union. The 4 areas are the rights of passengers with reduced mobility, airport charges, airport slots, and ground handling. A new 50-50 company between Gibraltar and Spain will be established in Ireland. That Irish company will award the tender to the operating company which will run the airport. Given that it is 50-50, there can be no changes to the existing arrangement without our consent. The ownership of the terminal will remain with the government. The ownership of the runway and the associated aprons and buildings will remain with the Ministry of Defence. There is no change of ownership. It will be possible for passengers or others to litigate against their JV in Gibraltar or in the court of any state to which the relevant international conventions apply. That mirrors a position during our time in the European Union. So the airport will benefit from a new relationship with the European Union, which at the same time protects our relationship with the United Kingdom, the best of both worlds. The foundations have been laid for a route network to the EU. Well, this opportunity is now up to the airlines to take up. The possibilities, as you will see, are endless. But there is one paradox in all this. While we were in the European Union, the airport was an area of conflict and controversy. Now that we are outside the European Union, it is set to become an area of cooperation. And in this contribution about Gibraltar and the EU, it is important to recognize that fact. This progress has materialized in spite of Brexit. But this talk is about the past, present, and future. So I'll make a few points now in relation to the land border. As I mentioned earlier, the frontier gates swung open in February 1985. But that did not mean that the border operated as a normal crossing point between 2 parts of the EU. Far from it. For decades, the manner in which Spain operated the land border was highly questionable. The passage of persons, vehicles, and goods was often held ransom by the state of political relations between Gibraltar and Spain at a given moment in time. But again, the EU institutions did not answer questions. And the border was subjected for decades to the same apathy that we experienced with the airport. But that changed. In 2013, the European Commission finally sent an inspection visit to the border. This came in response to lengthy delays instigated by Foreign Minister Margallo, in whose tenure queues peaked at 8 hours. That intervention came only after a high-level pressure from the UK itself. Prime Minister David Cameron interrupted his summer holiday and raised the matter directly with the President of the Commission, José Manuel Barroso. As a result, the European Commission sent 3 inspection visits to Gibraltar in 2013, 2014, and 2015. It took a while, but the Commission eventually declared that the checks which created the lengthiest delays were disproportionate. The situation at the border improved as a result of that intervention. But as many of us know, it was never perfect. Transit through the border had been weaponized by General Franco in the 1960s. It continued to be by his successors. The frontier was used as a pressure point, sometimes by ministers in Madrid, sometimes by regional and local authorities, sometimes through administrative obstruction, and sometimes by individual officers with their own agenda. And all this, even when both Gibraltar and Spain were in the European Union together. The target was always the same: the economy and the people of Gibraltar. But EU law nonetheless provided a degree of protection. That legal cover was lost completely when we left. It should be obvious that Brexit therefore had the potential to create a very serious challenge for Gibraltar at the border. So in looking at the picture for the future of the border, it is essential to bear in mind the circumstances of the past, the way in which it was abused, the way in which it was used for decades to target the economy of Gibraltar, the way in which it was seen as a route, a failed route, to secure a surrender of sovereignty. As a student of our history, I've always appreciated the value of learning from the past. And the lesson from the past in relation to the border was crystal clear. The coercive lever had to go. This context is essential to an understanding of the future of the controls at the land border. Because the border is not only a political boundary, it is also the daily crossing point for thousands of people on both sides, and the gateway through which the economy of Gibraltar connects with the surrounding region. In this area, once again, our departure from the European Union has created a paradox. This is that Gibraltar will enjoy greater border fluidity outside the European Union than we enjoyed when we were members of it. And that will come about through the interaction between the EU Schengen area and Gibraltar's own immigration law, through the marrying of the EU customs union and Gibraltar's own goods and customs legislation. The arrangement is not theoretical. It will remove immigration and customs checks at the land border while preserving the frontier itself, because that is where Spain ends and where Gibraltar starts. It is relevant to emphasize, too, that a departure from the European Union has given rise to border control arrangements which, again, are pretty much unique. This system of dual controls will be operated in a common immigration zone at Gibraltar Airport. First, the Gibraltar control, as we have today, followed by the Schengen control operated by Spain on behalf of the European Union. And it is also relevant to stress that Gibraltarians and Gibraltar residents will enjoy a number of exclusive benefits. They will have the right to return to Gibraltar. They cannot be refused entry into Gibraltar. They, or we, cannot be detained or arrested by the Schengen authorities. They will be exempt from the new electronic European entry-exit system, known as the EES. We will be exempt from the new EU pre-travel authorization scheme, known as ETIAS. There will be no immigration or customs controls at the border. No immigration controls on flights to and from the Schengen area. We will enjoy de facto non-application of the 90-day in 180-day rule. So leaving the EU will bring Gibraltar closer to the EU in these particular areas. And here again, we arrive at one of the great paradoxes of this story. Brexit took Gibraltar out of Europe, yet the solution brings Gibraltar closer to Europe than we were before. But Schengen here is a tool, not a flag. It is a practical arrangement, which means that there is no impact on Gibraltar's continued British sovereignty. And more than that, Gibraltarians and Gibraltar residents will enjoy the best of both worlds. Access for persons into the UK and into the EU, access to the UK market in services, and access to the EU market in goods for the first time. This talk today is about the relationship with Europe in the past, the present, and the future. A relationship which 96% of those voted supported in the 2016 referendum. A relationship which has evolved through time and space, and one which is set to develop and mature further going forward. But the border and the airport were not the only two areas impacted by Spain's accession to the European community. There were issues across the board. The European Commission approved a proposal by Spain which included Gibraltar's territorial waters as part of a Spanish marine protected area in 2007. Gibraltar went to court 2 times. Again, both actions failed on technical grounds. The appeal was kicked out by a panel of 3 judges, which included a Spanish judge with a history when it came to Gibraltar. In practice, therefore, the European Union became another arena in which that long-standing matter was played out. And this extended to other areas still. Madrid, for example, objected to competent authorities from Gibraltar and refused to recognize them or deal with them unless communication was through the United Kingdom. Spain also made use of the state aid mechanism to mount an assault on Gibraltar's taxation regime. And we often had to resort to court in defense of our legal rights. We even had to argue to exercise our right to vote in elections to the European Parliament, although that legal action was against the United Kingdom and not against Spain. So Gibraltar's position in the European Union became a whirlwind after Spanish membership, interspersed with occasional moments of calm. And nothing came easy. Nothing was handed down on a plate. For decades, Gibraltar had to defend itself against administrative, political, and legal action. The above is not an exhaustive list, but it was one issue after another. And this snapshot provides a flavor of what EU membership became after 1986. Those disputes were not about technical compliance. They were political contests conducted through legal or administrative means. And yet, despite all those difficulties, the framework of the EU provided a legal and political structure where Gibraltar could make its voice heard. Yes, Spain had a veto and a seat, but so did the United Kingdom. In 2004, Gibraltarians were able to vote in elections to the European Parliament for the very first time. This amplified the local voice. Those MEPs were directly elected by the people of Gibraltar, combined with the southwest of England constituency. The regional list elected 7, later 6 MEPs. And Gibraltar went on to win votes in the European Parliament. This included a particularly important one on the rights of passengers with reduced mobility. Some cases were won in court as well. One on the question of regional selectivity, for example, in taxation matters. And in 2006, the Córdoba agreements set out to place the relationship with Spain on a new footing. This was a political agreement. It was entirely voluntary, and it was not legally binding. The parties entered into those arrangements as a matter of policy because they thought it would be a good idea. But Córdoba did not survive a change of government in Spain, as I said earlier, and the departure of the United Kingdom and Gibraltar from the European Union on the 31st of January 2021, after the transitional period had come to an end, changed the rules of the game. A future relationship was no longer a voluntary policy option. A treaty became a necessity, as opposed to something which it would be nice to have. Gibraltar needed to act. And such action had to take account of the background which I have just described. So the dynamics of our connection with Europe have now changed again, and as they have been transformed over time too. We were outside the European Economic Community until 1973. Then we were part of the EEC, the EC, and the EU until 2021. And now we have been out of the European club for some 5 years. Importantly, as I said earlier, in 2016, Gibraltar voted for a relationship with the European Union. That relationship was membership. Membership is no longer possible because the UK has left. While it is not membership, the new treaty represents the closest structural relationship available to Gibraltar outside the EU framework. It is the closest to membership that is on offer, and it will protect Gibraltar in a number of ways. First, it will be legally binding. Second, the treaty itself includes an independent dispute resolution mechanism of its own. Third, the parties to the treaty are the United Kingdom and the European Union. This is not a treaty between the UK and Spain. In addition to all this, the termination clause provides an escape hatch in the event that it is ever required. But the new treaty will regulate the immediate future. What happens longer term? What could the distant future bring? Brexit itself has demonstrated just how quickly the impossible can become a reality. It is a reflection of how the relationship between Gibraltar and Europe has often rested on wider developments in the United Kingdom itself. So what about a decision to rejoin? Given the result of the 2016 referendum, UK political parties have, I think it's fair to say, been treading on eggshells here. Even the strongly pro-European Liberal Democrats, which are my sister party in the UK, describe rejoining only as a longer-term objective in their 2024 general election manifesto. The UK government, too, is itself performing a very delicate balancing act, wary of losing Labour seats to reform in strongly pro-Brexit constituencies. The much publicised reset has so far been little more than an agreement to agree, with the finer detail still to be worked out. Though only this week the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has floated the possibility of a closer alignment for the UK with EU commercial rules. It is clear, therefore, that rejoining cannot be ruled out in the future. And were that to occur, where would it leave Gibraltar? The answer to the question is not found by gazing into a crystal ball. Educated analysis would suggest that it would be unlikely for the UK to rejoin on the same terms that it enjoyed before it departed. So that could mean no more opt-outs, no more budget rebates, and no more special treatment. And all this is speculation, of course, but there is some logic behind it. The EU was not generous when the UK exited, and much would depend on the level of generosity on offer at that point somewhere in the future. Worse still, the EU might welcome the UK back, but not Gibraltar. We have learned from experience that decisions taken elsewhere can reshape our destiny overnight. So what does that mean? It means that the new UK-EU treaty will provide Gibraltar with a degree of legal certainty in the years ahead, because it establishes a framework that protects Gibraltar's interests regardless of what future decisions may be taken in London. This morning, my aim was to cover 45 minutes of Gibraltar's EU membership, 45 years in less than 45 minutes. And I look forward to what is to come, and to look forward to what is to come. But it's not possible to do justice to the subject in the time that is available. One thing is clear. The future is set out in a treaty which is now written. It has been translated, and it will be signed. Then the spotlight will move to the ratification process of the two sides. On the EU side, the treaty will need to be approved by the European Council. This is made up of all the member states of the European Union who authorized the Commission to enter into the treaty negotiations in the first place. And it will also require a vote in the European Parliament. Early this month, the Gibraltar Parliament signalled the UK Parliament to commence the ratification process on the British side. The UK will do so after Easter, after the treaty is signed, and then it will be laid in Parliament for 21 days under what they call the Crag procedure. Signature and ratification will then be followed by implementation. So this creates a new work stream, and there have been a series of phases in this process, and this is the latest one. So the work streams that I would point to, I would divide them into three general areas. The first is legal. These are the changes to the laws of Gibraltar, which will be required in order to give effect to the new treaty. Those legislative changes will cover a broad area of our existing legal framework. And you will have heard the Chief Minister say in Parliament that the meeting on Monday the 30th is expected to consider the framework of the European Union Relations Bill. The second work stream will be infrastructural. This will include, for example, new construction at the airport, equidistant into Gibraltar and Spain, where the external controls will be carried out. But there will be other physical works, such as roads, roundabouts, and buildings. Some of the construction will be internal. For instance, the underutilized Cordova corridors inside the air terminal are now being modified, and they will be put to good use. And that work, as I say, has already commenced. A third work stream will be administrative. That is, the system will need to achieve a better understanding of the treaty in order to give practical effect to it. I suppose the message is that the treaty work does not end with the conclusion of the negotiations. There was a negotiation, there was then a political agreement, there was then legal treaty text, then signature and translation, then ratification, and now finally an implementation process as well. So I want to reflect briefly in my closing comments on how all this came about, on how the United Kingdom came to exit the European Union and Gibraltar came to be landed in this predicament. Let me say first, as someone who firmly believed in the European project, that there were moments in this negotiation where I understood the sentiment of the Brexiteers. I mean, I did not agree with them, but I understood where they were coming from. For it was obvious long before Brexit that there was already an alarming disconnect between the leadership of Europe and the people of Europe in a number of areas. In June 1992, for example, the people of Denmark voted against the Treaty of Maastricht, and they blocked its ratification. So this was put to a second vote in May 1993, where the treaty was carried after certain opt-outs had been secured. In June 2001, the people of Ireland voted against the Treaty of Nice. There was, again, some tinkering with the wording, and they were made to vote again in October 2002, when the treaty was approved. In June 2008, the Irish again voted down the Treaty of Lisbon this time. And after certain guarantees, they were made to vote again in October 2009, where the amended treaty was approved. But perhaps the most interesting case came in 2005, when both the French and the Dutch rejected the so-called European Constitutional Treaty. This time, there was no second vote, and instead it was repackaged and presented again as the Treaty of Lisbon. So there is an argument to be made that at key moments in our history, the leaders of Europe were taking the people of Europe in a direction where clearly some did not want to go. And this is in part the approach which fanned the flames for the Brexiteers. But we are where we are. There is only a point now for further debate and for reflection. But in this university setting, it's important to bear in mind one important consideration. The relationship which we are constructing will shape the environment in which our young people will live, work, and build the next chapter of Gibraltar's history. So the path to secure that relationship with Europe has been a long journey, a journey which was complex and difficult, because Gibraltar's relationship with Europe has never been easy. It has been shaped by geography, by history, by power, and by politics. We have been outside Europe, inside Europe, and are now alongside Europe. Gibraltar has navigated the storm to safely sail into its port of call. But the treaty before us is not perfect. It does not erase the past, but I submit it does learn from it. It removes the weapons used against us. It replaces volatility with law, and it brings certainty where otherwise there would have been none. Gibraltar can plan, trade, and live within a defined framework. We have been driven here by necessity and arrived here by choice. And so I want to close with a reminder of what Winston Churchill is once said to have observed. And it is this: if Britain must choose between Europe and the open sea, she must always choose the open sea. Gibraltar has never had the luxury of that choice. We have always lived between Europe and the open sea. And we have learned not merely to survive there, but to prosper as well. And prosper we will. Thank you.